My name is Gina Tucker-Roghi, and I'm an occupational therapist. And I'm just going to set a little timer here. Sorry. Okay, try that again. So I'm an occupational therapist and an assistant professor in the occupational therapy department at Dominican University of California in San Rafael, just north of San Francisco. I will share my screen, and I have a slide deck to share with you. Okay. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about, in particular, about task simplification and activity modifications as a way to support occupational engagement for individuals with dementia. In the big picture, supporting the health, well-being, and quality of life of individuals with dementia. So my time and my training is supported by my Geriatric Academic Career Award grant from HRSA. So I thought I would start off with a little bit of discussion about what is occupational therapy. I'm sure that you're all at least somewhat familiar with occupational therapy, but we're often seen more within the traditional rehabilitation framework, medical model, and our scope of practice is broader than that. And that's actually part of my purpose of my GACA, my Geriatric Academic Career Award project, is to expand the impact of occupational therapists into other areas outside of just the traditional rehabilitation model. So occupational therapists help people across the lifespan participate in things that they want and need to do through the use of everyday occupations. And when we use the term occupations, we're using that term more broadly than to mean what somebody's job is or their employment. So occupations are everyday activities people do to occupy time and bring meaning and purpose to their life. So with in that more traditional rehabilitative model, you might be familiar with OTs being involved maybe after somebody's had a brain injury or they've had a hip replacement or a hip fracture. And in those cases, we're helping people to be engaged in what they need and want to do from a rehabilitative model by trying to get them better. But when we're working with individuals with chronic conditions or degenerative conditions, we shift. And we, instead of when I'm working with somebody with dementia, instead of trying to get that person better, which obviously is not a realistic goal or outcome, I try to change the world around that person so that they have an improved quality of life and improved functioning. So sometimes I can help them to function better by changing the environment, by changing the task demands, or by changing the approaches of the caregivers around them. So that's kind of the overarching framework. So OT interventions specifically related to individuals with dementia, this is some of what is evidence-based for us as OT practitioners, supported in our practice guidelines for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. So we use a collaborative problem-solving approach with the client and the caregiver, of course, to identify functional solutions. So we're really we're problem solvers. We're partners to the caregiver and to the person with dementia in trying to come up with functional solutions. And often our tools are related to adapting the environment or changing the task demands in order to promote the individual's best ability to function. That's always what we're after, is where is that sweet spot where I can match the task demands and the environment to what that person is capable of. In addition to the tools of adapting task demands and environments, also a major tool for us in terms of our intervention is caregiver education and also sometimes advocacy as well. So we start off with identifying the specific remaining abilities. We typically, often occupational therapists will use the Allen cognitive levels, which is a hierarchical scale of cognitive abilities. It's much more detailed than just what we know about the staging, maybe from the FAST or the global deterioration scale. You know, we maybe all understand somebody's in middle stage dementia, for instance, but when I use the Allen cognitive levels, I can understand a much clearer picture of sort of a typical pattern of performance that person will have with specific remaining abilities. And then when I know that, I can adapt activities to match their capabilities. So I could give you an example. Somebody who's in middle stage dementia is typically in Allen cognitive level 3. And even beyond just saying they're in Allen level 3, if I do my assessments and use the Allen cognitive battery, I could say, you know, somebody's in Allen level 3.2, for instance, or they're a 3.8. And somebody in the lower end of Allen level 2, for instance, I might be able to give them, people in Allen level 3 are able to use objects and they use their hands for function, but somebody down in Allen level low 3 will have sort of a clumsy ability to use objects. If I were to hand them a crayon and some paper, they would associate the crayon with the action of coloring, and they would maybe do just a little bit of back and forth coloring, but not really with any purpose or intention behind it. Whereas somebody at high Allen level 3 would notice the effect that their action has on the object. So they have that cause and effect ability. So I would see them move the color around to different places on the page, maybe trying to stay in the lines, for instance. I might see that same ability in a grooming activity. Maybe somebody is shaving and notices that this part of their face feels rough. And so they move the razor over here in order to smooth that out. So that cognitive ability is part of what we would call high Allen level 3, or noticing effects of actions on objects. So basically, when I identify somebody's Allen level and mode, that decimal point, I kind of have a really clear picture of what types of adaptations will be appropriate, what types of communication needs they might have, and I can really dial in a specific approach that's going to be effective for them, and then teach the caregiver that. In addition to really being highly specific about how we understand people's remaining abilities, we also use an occupational profile. And occupational therapists use an occupational profile for everybody we work with, not just people with dementia. But it's really essential for promoting person-centered care. It's like the story of that person. And we spend a fair amount of time gathering that information. When we're working with people with dementia, we often have to go to the family for that. But we're looking at their lifelong roles. What did they, what are, preferences and habits and routines, experiences that they've had in their life, so that getting that really comprehensive picture of who they are as an individual. So those two aspects are really kind of part of what we do in the when we're first trying to figure out what we have to offer this individual and how we're going to help them, part of our evaluation. In terms of our interventions, tailored activity plans are when we create activities that match that occupational profile. They're meaningful and relevant to that person, and they also fit their cognitive abilities. A tailored activity plan could be a leisure activity. It could also be a simulated work or an IEDL activity, maybe a housekeeping activity or a chore that was meaningful to that person. So we're taking that activity and simplifying it so that it is in that kind of just right challenge zone. When we're in OT school, we do a lot of what we call activity analysis. So if you ever want to hear about about OT school, you can ask an OT about what kind of activity analysis they had to do. But we learn to take different activities and break them down into all of their different component parts, look at what are the physical demands of that activity, the cognitive demands, the sensory demands, and then think about how would I change that activity in order to make it accessible or available for different types of conditions and disabilities. Other things, we're going to focus today on those tailored activity plans, but other things that OTs might do, adapting care approaches to optimize function. So how can we set up grooming and toileting and eating and bathing in a way that doesn't trigger neuropsychiatric behaviors and that optimizes function. We might work with individualized reminiscence programs or family education or caregiver education on effective communication techniques in order to continue to support social relationships and socialization and social interaction for individuals with dementia. And a lot of times families need help understanding how to do that, particularly once somebody no longer, remembers their children's name anymore. It's sometimes the family needs some support about figuring out how to still interact with them and have a meaningful visit. And actually, activity plans can be really helpful. So when families coming to visit, instead of just trying to converse when the language is really starting to be impaired and the memory is starting to be impaired, doing an activity together can be a nice way for them to have a meaningful visit. And then we're always involved in caregiver education and support. And I did mention as well that advocacy can sometimes be a really central part of what we do. So this is from Alzheimer's Association. A person living with dementia doesn't have to give up activities that they love. Many activities can be modified to the person's abilities. Engagement in activities, we know the evidence shows that it reduces neuropsychiatric behaviors such as wandering and agitation and contributes to overall quality of life. And I see that a lot of different folks on the interprofessional team, I think, know this, that activities and meaningful engagement is good. But I think that it's hard, and it's not, for people in early stage dementia, it's not so hard. They can still do simple crafts and play bingo and, do those types of activities. But when people get into middle and late stage dementia, it becomes trickier to engage them. And that is where I think the skills of an occupational therapist can really be quite helpful. This picture here, I'll share with you a little bit later, is a sample of an activity prescription that I did with somebody. So individualized activities or activity prescriptions, tailored activity plans, which is from Laura Getlin's work. And Laura Getlin's work on the tailored activity plan showed that individuals whose caregivers did engage them in individualized activities that were matched to their stage of dementia, that were relevant and meaningful to them, and that were, realistic for the caregiver to implement, that they had, decreased neuropsychiatric behaviors, and that the caregiver reported a reduced burden of care. So that's basically kind of the recipe that we're looking for, that the activity, that we modify it to make it stage appropriate, that it matches the Allen cognitive level. And in that, the research that Getlin et al. Did on the tailored activity plans, they were using the Allen levels. We have to take that time to get a really rich and meaningful occupational profile so that we can really tie activities to past roles and things that are meaningful to that person. And then lastly, we have to look at that care context and the environment. What's actually going to be possible in that physical environment with that caregiver. We also, and this could also be considered part of what's relevant and meaningful, but consider the time of day, their preferences, trying to fit things into routines and habits so that they're more likely to stick. That's another thing that we as occupational therapists really focus on, is occupational balance and how people fit occupations into their life, and time use and routines and habits. So that's another part of what we bring to this. I'm just going to check on my time here. Okay. So we're looking for that just right fit between the individual with dementia's abilities and the activity demands. So some of the things we might look at is the number of steps involved. We're looking at the number of features that they're attending to. Are the features visible and striking features? So, and An example I could give you of that is like in a sorting activity, for instance. I have these little crafting pom-poms that I use when I'm doing assessments. And if I just have somebody sorting between, blue and white pom-poms, that's a much lower task demand than if I hand them the whole pile that has different textures and sizes and colors. And that's more features for them to attend to. We're also looking at, is an activity novel or familiar? Certainly people do better with familiar tasks. Is there a need for recall of information? Is there a need for new learning? Problem solving. Problem solving is particularly troubling for people in early stage dementia. They do really well otherwise, but they really break down on problem solving, and then the length of time to complete the activity. So again, these are kind of some of the ways that we might adapt or change an activity, the number of steps or the number of materials that are available. We want materials to be like visually right in front of the person. We'll use visual prompts sometimes. Giving somebody a sample to work off of can really help them. So if I'm doing a coloring activity with somebody in middle stage dementia, I might give them a sheet that's already been colored and they can kind of copy what they're doing. Limiting distractions, controlling the environment. And then sometimes we enrich sensory aspects of a task or an environment to really help the person tap into that procedural memory that we're after. The same thing with using contextual cues and using familiar materials and locations. I can give you a self-care example of that. So if I'm trying to get somebody to do a grooming activity, I'm going to get a much better response if I have them standing in the bathroom in that familiar posture. They hear the water running, they're looking in the mirror, versus an emesis basin sitting in a hospital bed and they have dementia. They're probably not going to be able to follow my directions very well or orient themselves to the activity that we're doing. Considering the placement of materials in order to maximize attention and sequencing, and then we're also embedding our activities in routines. So for people in early stage dementia, they are goal directed. They want kind of a purpose in their activities. They have pretty good conversational skills. Where they really break down is with problem solving often, and then really new and novel. It's not too hard to engage people in early stage dementia in activities. They can understand the purpose of an activity, to stick with it and get through the sequence and the steps of an activity all the way to the end. So simple crafts, puzzles, familiar games. Familiar is kind of the key here. Simple crossword or word find puzzles. If you're getting refusal or disengagement, you probably need to look at, is the environment overwhelming? Are there too many steps? Is there something novel or new, or is there problem solving involved? For people in middle stage dementia, they're not goal directed. So they do best when we find a repetitive aspect of a familiar occupation or a meaningful occupation, and we just have them do that familiar thing over and over in a way that they can be successful. So I would, find objects or activities that are related to something that was really meaningful to them. I had a gentleman who had been an avid chess player. He couldn't play chess anymore. He was in middle stage dementia. But we had the family, that he was in a nursing facility, and we had the family bring in his old chess set, and he did sorting and polishing of the chess pieces, and it still kind of sunk into that sense of self that he had. So very simple and repetitive activities. And then when people are in late stage dementia, Allen level 2, we're really just, they lose their ability here to use objects. So we're looking at kind of automatic sorts of actions. Music is very helpful. Gross motor movements. They will, respond to a balloon or kick at things. Music and drumming sort of levels them up a little bit. So certainly incorporating music can be really helpful as well. And then sensory type activities. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with is a little sample. This is an activity prescription for a gentleman who was in early stage dementia living at home with his wife, and she was really concerned that he just had disengaged from things that had been meaningful to him in the past. He had been an artist, and he was just kind of on the computer all day, I think, kind of playing games or scrolling. He actually had quite a bit of capacity, but his space for his artwork was very cluttered, disorganized. He couldn't find things. He got frustrated. He wanted to do it alone. He didn't want help. And so, we worked with him. We kind of set up some steps to set the activity up. We tried having him be able to set the activity up alone. It turned out that he really needed that extra support for his wife to come in and set the space up, but then she could leave him and he could do his artwork on his own in that space that had been, familiar and meaningful to him for a long time. So this is the activity prescription, and then there's some suggestions about how to support him on a good day and a hard day, what types of cues, and then on an even harder day. And this is kind of an example of the goals that we had as occupational therapists to engage him in a modified, meaningful art activity with appropriate environmental modifications and visual cues to facilitate initiation and planning, that the caregiver and he together would engage in an individualized reminiscence activity to process their grief. Their daughter had recently passed away, so they were creating a scrapbook and looking at photos together, and then consistently engage in IDL and leisure occupations with a visual schedule. So they worked because he would get kind of caught up in the computer, so they created a schedule and had that posted. And like I said, he was early stage dementia, so he could use a schedule. And then down here is a little bit of the note. Caregiver will support clients' ongoing engagement with art by supporting initiation through use of daily schedule and environmental modifications for optimal setup. Caregiver trained on effective communication, such as using simple phrases, increased processing time to support client engagement. Caregiver and client will continue the co-occupation of reminiscence. Caregiver demonstrated understanding of task simplification. So he was really, that was a very successful activity prescription with him, and was quite meaningful. So I think that is what I have to share with you today. I hope you will seek out occupational therapists on your team and talk to them, involve them in the clients that you're caring for, patients that you're caring for with dementia. I will say the other part of my GACA project is making sure that OTs know that we need to be doing this as well. So there are OTs that have worked their whole career in the rehab model, and when they have a referral for somebody with dementia, their first reaction might be, well, they have dementia, they're not appropriate for therapy. So I'm trying to increase their understanding of their role. I hope that when you reach out to occupational therapists, you find folks who understand our role. There's certainly strong literature to support it. We have an excellent resource from our professional association on the practice guidelines for occupational therapists for working with individuals with dementia. And thank you so much for your time.